The better part of a man is soon plowed into the soil for compost. By a seeming fate, commonly called necessity, they are employed, as it says in an old book.
Aujourd'hui, nous allons échanger sur la place de la femme dans un pan choisi de la littérature européenne. Plus précisément, à travers les œuvres de deux écrivaines, Panni Puskás et Tina Vrščaj. Deux noms que vous ne connaissez sans doute pas encore, et j'ai envie de dire, en espérant que les maisons d'édition indépendantes françaises vont s'intéresser de près aux textes de ces écrivaines, à moins que vous ne parliez respectivement hongrois et slovène. La première, Panni Puskás, fait partie des nominés de l'édition 2024 de l'EUPL, le prix de littérature de l'Union européenne, tandis que la seconde, Tina Vrščaj, fait partie, elle, des mentions spéciales de la même année. Toutes les deux, à travers des univers très différents et des regards singuliers sur la société dans laquelle elles vivent, tissent des romans loin des sentiers battus, où la condition des femmes occupe une place primordiale. Avec ces deux écrivaines, nous parlons d'écriture et d'inspiration, de questionnement et problématiques sociales, mais également de la place de la femme dans la société contemporaine, en prenant en compte les particularités des pays concernés. Nous parlons également de l'EUPL et des portes que ce prix ouvre, des perspectives qu'il dessine en matière de circulation de la littérature européenne. Petit bonus, l'une des nouvelles de Panni a été traduite pour le Los Angeles Review. Vous trouverez donc le lien dans la bio. Et pour finir, Bouquet-Lichou, c'est un podcast faisant partie du label Podcut, lien et info dans la bio. Également, bonne écoute et bonne lecture. Good morning, Tina. Good morning, Panni. Thank you for this time and for this chat about your writing and the EUPL. To start, could you briefly describe your latest book, given that your works are not translated into French yet, and share what inspired you to write it? Tina, maybe you can start.
Okay. On Slope is a novel about the protagonist Eva, who lives on Slope, on a steep hill, with her two daughters and her husband. My experience of living in nature, so I actually lived isolated from civilization for about 15 years. That experience inspired me to write this work.
So it's very personal.
Yes, it has this autobiographical basis, especially from the environment. But of course, the story then is made up. It's fiction.
I see. And what about you, Panni? You are qualified, I saw on the EUPL site, as a punk writer.
Yes, I am. Hello, Tara. Hello, Tina. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So, yeah, actually, I wrote two books. The first is a collection of short stories where feminism comes up quite a lot. I mentioned that because I think we'll be touching on that topic today. My second book is a novel, which can also be read in a feminist way, even though that wasn't my main intention. It's a quiet, dense novel. A lot of happens in it. And it's really trying to give a big picture of our present here in Europe. The story is told through the lives of three women. And the first woman lives in Budapest and works for a multinational company as an office worker. She's unhappy, feels her life, has no meaning, and ends up struggling with different kinds of addictions, especially drugs, of course. And the second character is more melancholic. She's actually the first woman's sister, but that only gets revealed in the last third of the book. So I just given you a spoiler. He lives in Syracuse in Sicily, where at the time a ship full of Arab refugees is waiting on the sea because the Italian government won't allow them to dock. That part is based on a true story. There really was an NGO ship called Open Arms that wasn't allowed to dock during the Arab Spring. And this woman begins to empathize with the refugees and became obsessed with trying to save them. And there is one more spoiler. The third character, who writes the letters throughout the book, turns out to be the mother of the two sisters. She writes to the younger one, the office worker, because they haven't seen each other for a long time and their relationship ended badly. So, yeah. Yeah, and through these letters, the mother tells her story in the hope that the daughter will understand her and they may reconnect. And this is about my novel.
Okay, I see. So you mix something like a familial story with very personal themes we can meet in a family with major themes of the news and of the world going on today.
Yeah, that was my goal.
You said you wrote short stories. I saw that both of you actually write short stories, and Tina, you also write books for children. What attracts you in the short form? How are short stories received in your country? Because in France, it's quite complicated. Publishers and critics tend to despise a little bit this genre. What do you like in the writing of short stories?
Panni, will you start?
Yeah, of course. So it's probably not only true for Hungary that short stories are a good entry point for a writer into the literature world. That's why almost everyone starts their career with short stories. These texts usually get published in journals first, and only after that does it make sense to approach a publisher with a book project. But that's just the obvious general explanation, not my personal one. For me personally, writing short stories feels natural because my main profession is cultural journalism. So I have a lot of experience writing shorter pieces. If I have an idea, it very easily becomes a short story. And it's much easier for me to keep a text of that length, dense, and coherent. I'm also very interested in poetry, but I can't really write poems. Still, my short stories often echo the metaphorical quality of poetry. That said, writing a novel feels more exciting for me right now, exactly because it's such a challenge for me. Creating a bigger form takes me out of my everyday journalistic work. And what about Hungary? Yeah, in Hungary, short story collections aren't especially popular. But maybe that's true for Europe in general. People prefer reading novels, and the longer the better. I can only think of one Hungarian writer who has written nothing but short stories throughout her career and still became successful, and that's Edina Sforen. And by the way, she was also nominated to the European Union Prize for Literature. In my opinion, her short stories are really the best in contemporary Hungarian literature. Yeah, but the popularity of literature genres has always shifted throughout literary history, I think. And I'm sure it will again. So it's not that the short story has gone out of fashion forever.
Well, we hope so, that it's not out of fashion forever. And what about you, Tina? How is it? How would you describe your connection to the short story and the way it's perceived in Slovenia?
I must say that in Slovenia, the situation is quite similar to what you described. Readers and buyers of books prefer the novels, but maybe not the longer the better. I think they are more prone to shorter novels nowadays. However, the short stories are, yes, really less attractive, and also it is more difficult to publish a collection of short stories, especially if you're a beginner. I've published one collection of short stories. Those were the stories that came into being through several years, like about 10 years. On average, one story per year I wrote. And the stories came into being when I had an idea which I couldn't develop into a novel, into something complex. But otherwise, I'm very attracted to a novel. And just like you said, Panni, it's also a bigger challenge to me. And I really want to reflect the totality of modern being. And I can only do that in a novel where several characters and several dimensions are interacting.
It's very, very different the way you are going to structure your characters and what you mean to say. It's very different from a novel, of course, and a short story.
Yes, in the short story, you don't really have the space to actually develop the character or to show several aspects of certain situation. But sometimes some things need a shorter form. Or sometimes it's just a pragmatic decision, when you don't have time to write a new novel and then you write a short story. This is in my case.
And you have been both talking about your characters, and from the pitch you have introduced of your books, you said you depict female characters in situations of vulnerability or maybe crisis sometimes. How do you conceive the political and social dimension of women in your writing? Does it come very naturally from your observations, or do you really build something?
To give the full picture, for a long time, I was a feminist activist. I'm one of the founders of the first Hungarian feminist blog, which I'm very proud of. It was called Glass Ceiling about 10 years ago. And since then, I grown a bit tired of having to repeat the same arguments over and over again about the systemic oppression of women, while in Hungarian society, almost nothing seems to change. So I'm no longer an activist, but you can still see that background in my writing. One of the big problems I see with literature that deals with gender equality is that women are usually portrayed only as oppressed victims. I know that's often the reality, but I find it frustrating that their literary representation is reduced to that. My short story collection was maybe different because the women in it rebel against the oppressed positions. In fact, to the extreme. I give you an example. One story is titled after an American country song, Keep Your Woman at Home.
Mhm.
It's told from the perspective of a woman whose boyfriend locks her in the basement for her whole life. And then she spends all those years rationalizing to herself why is it actually her own decision. And at the very end, she's already old. She finally goes to the door, presses down the handle, and realizes it was never locked. And in another short story is about an anxious teenage girl who gets her first period at school, stains her clothes, and she's too embarrassed to leave the bathroom. And in the end, she solved the problem by phoning the school and lying there is a bomb in the building. And when the building will be evacuated, she simply walks out at the back door. So for me, it's very, very important that we as women take our lives into our hands.
Yes. Well, you said you are not an activist anymore, but it seems that in your writing, the feminist activist is still here somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally.
And what about you, Tina?
I understand, Panni, what you're talking about. And I agree that female characters should not only be portrayed as victims. That's not the only way to be critical about or to get the grip of the problem. I would say that in Slovenia, maybe the situation is a little bit different. I would say that the changes have happened, and there are many women writers in Slovenia getting awards. And what's most important, they are really good, like Ana Svetel, Mojca Kumerdej, Katarina Marinčič, and several others. Really, really fine authors, so that men writers sometimes feel endangered a little bit. And those of the older generation are sometimes saying, in the privacy of their homes, of course, just women are getting the awards nowadays. So the things are changing. Even our president of the Republic of Slovenia is a woman, and a very articulated one, a very intelligent. Then the president of National Assembly is a woman. And really, I see the changes in every aspect of our lives. That doesn't mean that there are no, traditional situations or sexism or all these situations will remain forever, I guess. Some things are in human nature, some things are due to biological differences. But also I, in my personal experience, as a writer, as a mother, as a wife, I can say that I have every possibility to be also fully employed at the same time and writing novels. I really need the support from the society, from my boss, and who is a man, and from my husband to go on with my writing career, and having children at the same time and so on. So all this couldn't happen. We couldn't have this conversation if the things haven't been changed already. So I really have good thoughts on this. And as far as my character, Eva, in my last two novels, she's a protagonist who embodies some typical feminine characteristics, but also sometimes is portrayed beyond that. She also has, for example, ethical dimension. She's very responsible towards the children and towards the family and the environment, whereas her husband is actually not. So the roles are a bit different now, where a woman actually participates in society and has a very important role in the society.
Both of your visions, and it seems, and both of your writings reflect something different, a different perspective and different mentalities across Europe.
I think it's important, really, what your everyday life in your country is, and this experience marks you and marks your writing, I guess.
As writers, you reflect the society and the social dimension you live in.
Yes, and I prefer like mimetic kind of art and not showing just the idea, to have an idea of what a woman should be nowadays and what she should achieve, and to portray this idea. I want protagonists from flesh and blood and to be as real as possible with all disadvantages also. So to be a full person, human being, before being some idea of a woman or something.
I read the excerpt of your books on the EUPL site and saw that family and intimate life seem to have quite a prominent place in your books. As we said earlier, tensions with the contemporary society. But it seems that the everyday violence and the burdens are not represented in a very explicit way in your writings. You seem to picture it by little spots. How do you deal with this everyday violence in your writings?
Actually, I try to depict these themes somewhat subtly with absurdity and ironic humor. On one hand, I'm not very interested in straightforward, easily understandable situations. On the other hand, they don't make good literary material, I think. I give you an example. If someone wants to depict violence against women in a book, in most cases, all they can really say is that violence against women is wrong and unacceptable. And any other message about it would be deeply immoral. In case of such clear questions, I think better form would be an essay or a journalistic piece. And fiction needs more complex questions, as I see. The opening story of my short story collection, for example, and it's an example for absurdity. It's about women claiming space in literature. It's called Reckoning with Bukowski, and it's about a young female writer who invites Charles Bukowski to dinner, and she will be greatly disappointed because Bukowski isn't interested in her poem at all. He just wants to drink her beer and sleep with her. But even that doesn't work because Bukowski is impotent. I know it sounds strange, but it's a pretty funny story. And by the way, it's English translation published on the Los Angeles Review website if anyone wants to read it. I have one more, maybe better example. In my novel, the mother figure is an amoral character. You could even say she's a truly bad person with no self-reflection. But in her letters, she tells her daughter the story of her life. And through that, a lot of became clear about why she turned out this way and why she's unhappy. And partly it's her own responsibility, of course, but she's also a victim of circumstances, postpartum depression and oppressive relationship and so on. So I do touch on these topics, but usually they are in the main focus, if you understand.
And what about you, Tina?
My protagonist, Eva, her biggest challenge is to get from unemployed mother in an isolated village towards a more active, to get employed and to fix her relationship with her mother, Panni. That's a similarity between our writings. There's also this relationship between a daughter and a mother, which needs to be fixed a little bit. And yeah, that's her challenge, especially when her husband leaves her with the children. She maybe at some points feels as a victim, but then later she surpasses these feelings and goes over all the burdensome emotions to get more active and to know that she has some control over her life and she can decide how she will feel and what her next step will be. And then the things around her are getting to change for better. And I'm developing her story and her character in my sequel, in last novel, which is going to be published this month or maybe next month. I don't know when exactly, but it has gone to printing already.
Do you identify with specific European literary currents, literary trends in your countries, or do you just write whatever you feel like writing?
Not really European. I was greatly influenced by American postmodernism, especially the works of Bret Easton Ellis. In my short story collection, I also experiment with what happens when women write about the same blunt and disgusting things that Ellis does. It's funny because Hungarian literary criticism typically calls my prose shocking and provocative, whereas if a man wrote the same thing, they probably wouldn't. I was also influenced by the British in your face theatre movement, like the works of Sarah Kane or Carrier Churchill. And I drew a lot of inspiration from Roberto Bolaño as well. I really love his freedom and his madness. And the Hungarian side is a bit harder to explain so that not non-Hungarian listeners can understand. But in the 1970s and 80s, there was a Hungarian neo-avant-garde movement which produced a lot of experimental works, especially in the theater and visual art, but also in literature. And I find the freedom of those young artists very inspiring. And the way they created their own world through art under a dictatorship And yeah, of course, what I've taken from studying those works is more of an attitude than a form, because the specific experimental forms they use would feel somewhat anachronistic today. Yeah, and these are the things that immediately came to my mind.
It's very diverse. And what about you, Tina? Do you feel like a European connection, or is it more diverse also?
Well, I've studied comparative literature, so that was sort of world literature. But I think, yes, I am more inspired by European writers. I like classics as well as contemporary writers. And if I just tell a few names from female writers who influenced my writing, those are, for example, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Juna Barnes, Toni Morrison, and maybe also Iris Murdoch, whom I dealt with in my thesis. I studied her philosophy and her novels and the philosophical ideas in her novels, how they were literally represented. So she really, influenced my thought. And yeah, but otherwise I wouldn't say there are some specific currents with which I identify. Or in Slovenia, there's probably no such thing as, having this like group of writers writing the same way. I think the individuality is now prevalent.
And to finish, in a few words, what does the recognition of the EUPL, the European Union Prize for Literature, mean to you? What opportunities and encounters has the prize brought you so far?
On one hand, I found it very honorable to be chosen by the Hungarian jury, especially because I see so many great Hungarian writers in my generation. It was also my first time in Belgium, which was a really special experience for me. And I'm happy that I got to meet other writers. And for example, that Tina and I are here together in this podcast. So, yeah. And what I didn't know in advance, but consider an important outcome, are the translations of my books. My novel has already been published in Serbia, and soon my short story collection will be too. In addition, translations into Bulgarian, Macedonian, and German are already underway. And it's also possible that it will be published in Slovenia, so Tina will be able to read it if she wants.
Yes.
And this is already much more than I could have ever imagined. And I'm just very grateful for it.
That's great. And for you, Tina?
The same, also a very pleasant experience, many nice opportunities, plenty of precious encounters. Especially I've met some great translators, traveled to Brussels, and the book received much more attention than it would otherwise. And of course, this is an honor that stays with me. It doesn't go away. It's forever.
Yes, it's a forever recognition and label.
Yes. All the journalists are always now repeating this copy-paste. So it's a good thing, yes, which happens. And of course, you need to also be lucky. It's not enough to write maybe a good piece of work, but you also need to be lucky to get recognized at the right moment.
So thank you very much for your time and for everything that you have shared with us. I hope we'll read you soon in French, and I will show the links for what we can read from you in English.
Thank you, Tara.